Chapter 1. This is what you get for being in the office on Christmas Eve, I thought, as I watched the car parallel park in front of my office. It was the 4th year of widowhood, but I still hadn't figured out how to have a successful holiday season at home. After spending the past few Christmases out of town, I'd convinced myself to stay home this year. Unfortunately, I'd overestimated the amount of business that would present itself in December, and most of my days had been spent organizing and filing paperwork. Now that it was Christmas Eve, a specific pang of loneliness throbbed in my throat. My husband Derek had been a Christmas fanatic. He'd start streaming lights around the edge of the house the day after Halloween. Every time I closed my eyes, memories of the warm, fresh scent of pine or the aroma of a huge, hot, bubbling piece of apple pie slipped through my thoughts. The sights, the sounds, the smells of the season permeated my senses, even though I hadn't participated in any festivities since Derek's death. I had wonderful memories, but now, being at home during the holidays meant facing a silent, empty homestead. That was why I was at the office organizing receipts for tax season. To drive away the pangs of loneliness, I started the day with a shot of vodka. Normally, I stayed away from alcohol, but there were days when the bitter poison slowed my thoughts and helped me to forget. By 10 a.m., I was combing through mounds of receipts. After about an hour, I took a break and paced the office, noticing how loudly Martin, my brother-in-law, who also was my assistant, was snoring at the adjacent desk. I poured myself another shot. Even though we had nothing on the books, Martin had decided to come into work. We were both there for unspoken comfort. I walked over to the picture window, drank the vodka down in one swig, and sat on the ledge. Michigan was playing its usual bipolar weather game. The previous week, a foot of snow had fallen, but now temperatures were in the low 40s, and a cold, unforgiving rain had been beating against the window for the better part of 3 days. I was staring at Michigan Avenue, admiring the stillness of the town below, when the car came whipping into view. I watched the sporty, black Mazda 3 squeeze itself into a teeny space between Martin's Camry and an old rusted Bonneville. I smacked the bottom of Martin's hiking boot. "Look alive, someone's coming." "What?" "We have a client." "Where?" "On his way up." "How do you know it's for us?" Martin asked, leaning back in the chair and attempting to return to his nap. "Because no one else in this building is stupid enough to be open. Get up," I said, pushing the back of his chair to an upright position. "Geez, Sylvia," he said, scratching his head before sitting up straight. I tossed the bottle of vodka into the bottom dress drawer and pushed the receipts aside. I opened my laptop, and a few minutes later, I buzzed the man into the office. He was drenched from head to toe. "Hello," I said, before holding out my hand and waiting as he pulled off his rain-soaked parka. He waved my hand away and gingerly hung the parka on the coat rack. When he looked up, I immediately recognized his face. "My name is Sylvia Wilcox. How may I help you?" Carson Stark was his name, and he'd been on the nightly news for months following his wife's untimely demise. He was just as lanky as he'd looked on television. About 6'4" and bald, with huge, haunting blue eyes. And he had a long, sharp nose that was slightly off-kilter, indicating that he had probably broken it at some point. The crow's feet in the corners of his eyes told me that he was older than he seemed, but his body was sleek and trim, like that of a long-distance runner. When he failed to respond or move, I decided to prompt him a second time. "I'm Sylvia Wilcox. What can I do for you?" I asked, stretching out my arm once more for a handshake. He gave my palm a weak shake, headed towards the desk, and dropped into the chair next to Martin without any explanation. I took a quick mental inventory of the man. Carson Stark reeked of old money. The sporty but economical Mazda 3 reinforced the fact that he had nothing to prove to anyone. He'd always had money and always would have it, so there was no need to be flashy. His creased brow was a direct result of his wife's murder, because this was a man who had been able to fix just about any problem that had come into his life. Losing his wife and not having answers was killing him. You need a private investigator, right? I said. He nodded but didn't elaborate. After a long, uncomfortable pause, I said, "Start from the beginning." I sat down in front of my laptop, opened a new document, and cast a sideways glance at Martin, signaling that he should leave. Martin introduced himself and quickly disappeared into the teeny room next to the office, shutting the door behind himself. During my brief stint as a private detective, I'd learned that it was better to do an initial consultation one-on-one. Clients were more apt to be candid if they were spilling their guts to a single person. "My wife," began Carson Stark, only to have emotion choke his throat closed. He dropped his head, his eyes shut tight. "My wife was murdered. I want to know what happened to her. The police have no leads, and they've interrogated me to the point of harassment. Now they aren't really even investigating the case. I have to know what happened." Tears welled in his eyes. I pulled out a box of tissues and pushed it towards him. "How long has it been?" I asked. 17 months. "Who do you think would do this?" "That's the thing. I don't know. She was a beautiful person, and I can't think of anyone who disliked her. She was a great mother, wife, and friend. The world was better when she was here." He couldn't think of anyone who would hurt his wife, but the reality was that someone had done much more than hurt her. Someone had taken her life, and life-taking, although sometimes the random endeavor of a stranger, was more often a passion-riddled deed carried out by an acquaintance. "I will need more information before I decide if I can help. What angles did the police share with you?" I asked. "They think it was me, but they have no proof because I'm innocent. She was murdered on the west side of Detroit, and I have no idea why she would be there. Without GPS, I personally don't even know how to get to the spot where her body was found." "Any other suspects?" "None that I know of, although there's speculation that she was having an affair." I remembered the story well. Carson Stark, a Northfield Township doctor, had lost his wife to murder. She'd been shot in Brightmoor, an incredibly poor section of Detroit on the edge of Redford Township. I'd worked in that area, the 8th Precinct, where the murder had taken place, before becoming a detective. Most of my old colleagues thought that the wife had been having an affair with a drug dealer. "I remember the story from the news. She was shot, right?" "Yes." "Do you have a photo of her?" I asked. "Of course." He dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small stack of pictures. He gazed lovingly at the photo on top before handing it to me. Liza Stark had been almost perfect. 5'6", about 35 years old, with soft aqua eyes that stared into the camera, and a well-practiced smile featuring her straight white teeth. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled into a ponytail that cascaded down her back. She was posing next to a petite woman with beautiful sable-colored skin. They stood arm in arm, wide smiles on their faces. Both women were striking, but there was a hardness in Liza's otherwise pretty smile. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Liza is the blonde, correct?" "Yes." "Who is the other woman?" "Madeline Price. I thought it would be good for you to know what she looks like as well." "Why's that?" "She was the last person to talk to Liza before she..." They were supposed to meet for a coffee date, but Liza never showed up. Madeline waited for a while, but eventually left and called to let me know that Liza had stood her up. "Do you suspect that Madeline Price had something to do with the murder?" "Oh, no. It's just, I just thought you might want to talk to her. She and Liza were best friends." Yes, I will definitely need to talk to her." "I'm very sorry you lost your wife," I said, handing the photo back to Mr. Stark. He didn't reach out to take it. "Can you help me?" Good question. Murder is hard to solve even when you have an organized police force on your side. I was a one-woman agency with a law school dropout assistant. The case was too big for me, and I'd promised myself that homicide was off the list for my agency. Mr. Stark, I want to help, but I have a small operation here, and I don't really take homicide cases. I have... You've lost a spouse, and it changed your life. You know what this is like. I pushed the laptop aside and stared at Carson Stark. He had investigated me. That was common, but people usually wanted to know about my credentials, not my personal life. Don't be alarmed. You come highly recommended. An officer in Detroit greatly admires you. He told me your story and why you left the police force. Said you couldn't take not knowing. That you fought and fought until you solved cases. Made you unpopular amongst the other officers. He also told me you have a master's degree in criminology, near the top of your class. I didn't know whether to be impressed or if I needed to contemplate filing a personal protection order. Well, I guess you've done your homework. I assume that means you also know that all those highfalutin tricks that fictitious PIs use will land me in jail. Once I turned in the badge, I turned it back into a regular citizen. Private investigating isn't as glamorous or as fun as it looks. Intuition, feelings, and what people say guide the way. Sometimes the police are helpful, but other times they're offended by the intrusion of an outside entity. That's the thing. Whatever happened to Liza won't be discovered through a traditional police investigation. I need someone who can feel and discern the small details. You've been able to see things that aren't seen by a typical police officer's eye. I had lost my spouse under mysterious circumstances. I didn't have the full truth of the matter. But on long, cold nights, I pulled out all the information I had about my husband's death and looked for answers. This case would be a reminder that spouses are sometimes unjustly taken away. The idea that there was a selfish killer out there that needed to be caught would be too much for me. I would get caught up in the case and lose myself. But I had a yearning for justice, and Carson Stark deserved that. The case had fallen away from the active roster at the precinct. Liza Stark had been written off as a cheater who had gotten what she deserved, but no one deserves to be murdered in cold blood. Okay, Mr. Stark, I'll do my best. Please find the person who did this to her. They left my children motherless. And me. I'm sorry for your loss, I said again, before giving him a few minutes to regain his composure. Once the lines in his brow eased, I began a battery of questions. Let's start with that morning. Did anything out of the ordinary happen? She was herself, nothing out of the ordinary. A bit flustered with the kids, perhaps, but that had been the case for a while. Isabel was 2 and Shane was 3 at the time. We just hired a housekeeper and part-time nanny to help. Was she more flustered than normal that morning? Even a slight change can mean something. I didn't think much of her being flustered at the time. It had been going on for a while. The kids are 17 months apart, and as they got older, they became more of a handful. Normal, right? I think Liza was just exhausted from the stress of the previous 4 years. I was gone all the time. I had only been at the hospital a few months, and the workload was much heavier than it was at my previous assignment. That's why I suggested that we get her some help. When was the nanny scheduled to leave that day? I asked. 7 p.m. Neither of our kids have ever napped much, so they go to bed early. The nanny was originally scheduled to work a few hours a day, but by that time she was working from 1 to 7, 5 days a week. Tell me about the hours that led up to your departure for work. Any details, regardless of how small, might be helpful. We bathed and played with the kids. After that, we headed to lunch, spent time in a park. Liza told me she was going to run errands, get a manicure, and meet a friend for coffee. So the nanny was there to watch the kids while Liza ran errands? Yes, she was originally just going to do housekeeping for us, but she really clicked with the kids, and Liza needed more time to herself. Having two toddlers is stressful, so it made sense that Liza needed a break, but it also brought up questions about what she was doing during those breaks. Do you think Liza ended up in Brightmoor on her own accord? I don't think so. But she was driving and her car was found unscathed. I guess that means that she drove there herself, which leaves me with more questions. I don't know. Maybe she got lost or something, but there's really no excuse for her to have been there. Interesting way to phrase the explanation. A good reason didn't have to be present. Sometimes people are irrational. Sometimes they have secrets. Brightmoor was a wasteland of firebombed houses, drug houses, and party stores. There wasn't really a good reason for non-residents to be in the area. Liza was meeting a friend, Madeline, correct? Yes, Madeline Price, her best friend. The other woman in the photo, Carson said. And she didn't make it to the coffee date, right? Nope. But she called Madeline and told her she was running late. That was around 3 p.m. She sent a text message around 20 past 4. That was the last activity on her cell phone. Does Madeline live in Northville too? No, she lives in Ann Arbor, not far from here. Do you know where they were meeting? No, Carson said, his brow creased. At the time, it didn't seem important. I'll need Madeline's information. Carson nodded, and an awkward pause filled the office. I wasn't sure where to start. I hoped it wasn't an infidelity case gone wrong, but from what I was hearing, the possibility was there. Most of my work came from former trophy wives turned soccer moms who wanted proof of infidelity so that they could get a sizable divorce settlement. Men were notoriously bad cheaters, so those cases were always simple and fast. But women who cheated on their husbands? Those cases could be tough, and solving a murder that took place in a city that vies for the murder capital of the country on a yearly basis was an entirely different story. Does Liza have family in the area? Yes. I waited, but nothing came. May I have their names? I'd rather leave them out of this. That's not possible, Mr. Stark. If you want me to take the case, I need all the information. Things might get uncomfortable. If you don't want that, we can't move forward. A pained look came across his face. Murder can drive a serious wedge between family members, but there was no getting around talking with them. Mr. Stark, I understand how hard this must be for everyone involved, but I will need to talk with Liza's family. Does she have any siblings? Are her parents alive in the area? Liza has a brother, Peter Abernathy, but they weren't close. I doubt he'd know anything. Her parents, Ralph and Janice Abernathy, live in Livonia, but we rarely saw them. I paused and allowed Carson to rattle on about the insignificance of Liza's family. A curious thing about marriage is that it provided a false sense of familiarity. You live, eat, and sleep with your spouse. The repetition of seeing that person every day creates the fabrication that you know them better than anyone. And maybe you do, but then again, maybe you don't. I'd like to speak to Liza's brother and parents, just to be thorough. May I have contact information for Peter, Madeline, and Mrs. and Mr. Abernathy? I asked, forcing a smile that I hoped was reassuring. Carson continued the unbroken eye contact. A few silent, motionless minutes passed before he pulled out his phone. He gave me the information and slipped back into a blank stare. I could almost hear the wheels in his head turning. Do you need money? Mr. Stark asked. Just the retainer. You can transfer the money online when you get a chance. We shook hands and I walked him out, informing him that I'd be in touch when I had information to share. After that, I gently closed the door and took a moment to compose myself. The past bubbled up in my soul. Losing a spouse was one thing, but losing a spouse and having no idea why they were gone was unbearable. The feeling was all too familiar. I shook off the thought and called Marty into the office. "We've got a case." "Yes," Martin said, holding up his hand for a high five. "Don't get too excited. We are in over our heads."